Picture the city of Rome in the year 48 AD. It is the marble heart of civilization, the undisputed center of the known world. A sprawling metropolis of over 1 million people, governing an empire of 50 million souls. The legions stand guard on distant frontiers. The granaries are full with tribute from Egypt, and the gods, it seems, are smiling upon their chosen people. But a sickness festers in the palace, a rot that has taken root in the imperial family itself. This sickness has a name, Valeria Messalina. She is the Empress of Rome, the third wife of the Emperor Claudius, and she is about to stage an event so obscene, so utterly contemptuous of Roman tradition, that it will be whispered about in horror for the next 2,000 years. In the shadows of a clandestine brothel, she, the most powerful woman on earth, will challenge the city's most accomplished prostitute to a competition. The contest is simple. Who can take the most lovers in a single night? This was not just an act of private indulgence, it was a grotesque public performance. A carnival of depravity designed to shatter every last illusion of imperial dignity. This is the story of a woman who had everything: power, beauty, wealth, and status, and chose to risk it all, not for a political cause or a grand love, but for the thrill of her own degradation. Before we descend into this abyss of ambition and appetite, if you are fascinated by the dark, often hidden stories of those who wielded absolute power, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that peels back the gilded facade of history. And please, comment below to let me know where in the world you're watching from. It's a powerful thought that we can explore these ancient scandals together, united by a shared curiosity across time and space. What you are about to hear is not just a tale of Roman excess. It is a terrifying psychological portrait of a woman who confused power with impunity, a teenage empress whose insatiable hunger for control, for validation, and for the forbidden would lead her to commit acts of such astonishing recklessness that she would end up forcing the noblewomen of Rome, the wives and daughters of senators, into a nightmare of her own making. To understand Messalina, you must first understand the man she married, the Emperor Claudius. He was the most unlikely emperor in Roman history. For 50 years, he had been the laughingstock of the imperial family, afflicted with a limp, a stutter, and various physical tics. He was considered an embarrassment, a bumbling fool who was deliberately kept out of public life by his ruthless relatives, Augustus, Tiberius, and Caligula. This very incompetence was what saved him. When the Praetorian Guard assassinated the mad Emperor Caligula, they found Claudius hiding behind a curtain, trembling with fear. In a moment of bizarre inspiration, they proclaimed this terrified 50-year-old scholar the new master of the Roman world. Claudius, against all odds, turned out to be a surprisingly effective administrator. But he was also deeply insecure, paranoid, and easily manipulated, especially by those closest to him. He was a man who had survived by being underestimated, and he never truly shed the feeling that he was an imposter on the throne. Into this power vacuum stepped Messalina. She was his third wife, a young, vibrant, and stunningly beautiful woman from one of Rome's most aristocratic families. She was also his great niece. They married when she was likely just a teenager, around 16 years old, while he was already in his late 40s. It was a political match, designed to connect Claudius to the heart of the Roman nobility. For Messalina, it was the ultimate prize. She was not just an empress, she was the wife of a man who was utterly dependent on her. She gave him 2 children, Octavia and, most importantly, a son, Britannicus. As the mother of the heir, her position seemed unassailable. She was the future of Rome, the beautiful young face of a new dynasty, and she understood with a chilling clarity the power that this gave her. While Claudius was busy managing the empire's infrastructure and legal system, Messalina began to manage the empire's power structure, and she did it with the subtlety of a predator. At first, her methods were conventional, if ruthless. She operated within the brutal snake pit politics of the Roman court. Anyone she perceived as a threat, a rival noblewoman who might catch the emperor's eye, a senator who questioned her influence, a courtier who knew too much, was systematically eliminated. Her preferred weapon was the charge of adultery. In a move of breathtaking hypocrisy, she, a woman whose own appetites were becoming the subject of frantic whispers, would accuse her enemies of sexual misconduct, a crime that often led to exile or execution. She understood that in a society obsessed with female purity, it was the perfect, irrefutable weapon. She destroyed Julia Livilla, the niece of Claudius, out of sheer jealousy. She engineered the downfall of the great philosopher Seneca, having him exiled on trumped-up charges of an affair. She was not just indulging her whims, She was consolidating her power, creating a court filled with her own allies and sycophants, a place where no one dared to say no to the Empress. But this cold, calculating political maneuvering was not enough to satisfy the hunger inside her. The secret thrills of the palace, the clandestine affairs with handsome actors and ambitious senators, began to feel too small, too safe. The very power she had accumulated had become its own kind of gilded cage. She needed more. She needed to feel the thrill of true transgression, to not just break the rules, but to shatter them in the most public and spectacular way imaginable. And so she began her descent, not in a grand, tragic fall, but in a series of deliberate, gleeful leaps into the abyss. The palace, with its whispering corridors and gilded formalities, had become her playground, but now she craved a different stage, a place where her imperial status meant nothing, a place where she could shed the skin of Messalina the Empress and become something else entirely, something raw and anonymous. She found this stage in the Suburra, the teeming, filthy, and vibrant underbelly of Rome. This was a place the nobility avoided, a labyrinth of cheap taverns, gambling dens, and brothels where life was cheap and pleasure was a commodity. It was here, in the heart of the city's squalor, that she would create her most enduring and infamous legend. She adopted a pseudonym, Lysiska, meaning the she-wolf, a name dripping with the predatory, feral energy she wished to embody. Under the cover of darkness, accompanied by a single trusted handmaiden, she would slip out of the palace, her aristocratic features hidden beneath a common wig and a cheap cloak. Her destination was a specific brothel, one she may have even owned through a proxy. There, she would rent a single, cell-like room, a space with nothing more than a straw mattress and a flickering oil lamp. This was the setting for her performance. The ancient historian Pliny the Elder describes what happened next, in a passage that has scandalized readers for centuries. Messalina, the empress of the Roman world, the descendant of Augustus, would stand at the door of her cell, her body exposed, and solicit customers like any common prostitute. But this was not about money. It was about conquest. It was about a hunger so profound that it could only be sated by pushing her body and her identity to the absolute limit. This culminated in the legendary competition. She laid down a formal challenge to the most famous and accomplished prostitute in Rome, a woman named Scylla, who was a master of her trade. The challenge was a marathon of debauchery. Who could service the most men in a single 24-hour period? Imagine the scene, a filthy, wine-stained room in the heart of the Roman slums. On one side, a hardened professional, a woman whose body is her business. On the other, the Empress of Rome, a teenager driven by a psychological compulsion that no one around her could possibly understand. The contest began. Men, likely paid for their services and their silence, lined up. For Scylla, this was a job. For Messalina, it was a sacrament of self-destruction. The hours crawled by. The historian Juvenal, writing a generation later, but with access to the court gossip that had solidified into legend, describes her with a chilling phrase, "Lassata, sed non satiata," exhausted, but not yet satisfied. This is the key to her entire psychology. It was not about pleasure. It was about the insatiable void at the center of her being. No amount of sensation, no number of partners could ever fill it. The contest was a physical manifestation of a spiritual black hole. By dawn, Scylla, the professional, had given up, admitting defeat. The score, according to Pliny, was 25 men. Messalina, however, continued, her body a mere instrument for a will that refused to break, a hunger that refused to be sated. What kind of person does this? This was not the act of a simple hedonist. It was the act of a woman who felt so utterly powerful and simultaneously so utterly empty that the only way she could feel anything real was through the most extreme forms of transgression. In her world, every door was open to her. Every luxury was hers for the taking. Every person, from the highest senator to the lowest slave, bowed before her. This absolute lack of resistance, this frictionless existence, had created a profound and terrifying boredom. By casting off her identity and becoming Lysiska, the she-wolf, by placing herself in a position of ultimate degradation and vulnerability, she was creating the friction, the danger, the reality that her life as an empress lacked. The ultimate act of control, for her, was to completely lose control. The ultimate expression of her imperial power was to pretend she had none. It was a declaration of war against her own identity, a ritualistic act of self-annihilation performed for an audience of strangers. And what of her husband, the emperor. The ancient sources are unanimous. Claudius was completely oblivious. While his wife was rewriting the boundaries of human depravity in the slums, he was poring over aqueduct blueprints, judging legal disputes, and writing his histories of the Etruscan people. He was a scholar, an administrator, a man who saw the world in terms of texts and laws, not in terms of the dark, chaotic passions of the human heart. He was a man who on some level probably did not want to know. The whispers must have reached him, the rumors that swirled through the palace like a foul miasma. But to acknowledge them would be to acknowledge his own powerlessness, his own humiliation. He was the emperor of Rome, but he was not the master of his own house. And so he retreated into the comforting certainties of his work, leaving the governance of the court and of his own wife to others. This ignorance, whether willful or genuine, created the perfect environment for Messalina's madness to metastasize. Her secret life in the brothel was not an isolated act of insanity. It was a symptom of a diseased court, a corrupt imperial system, and a marriage that was a hollow political shell. And it was only the beginning. The thrill of private degradation was about to evolve into a far more dangerous and public spectacle. The thrill of her double life, however intense, could not last forever. The danger, which had been the source of its excitement, began to feel routine. The anonymity of the slums, which had once been a liberating escape, now felt like a limitation. She was the Empress of Rome, and her power was absolute. Why should she have to hide? Why should she be forced to sneak through the shadows to indulge a hunger that, in her mind, was as vast and as legitimate as the empire itself? A profound and dangerous shift occurred in her psychology. The desire to degrade herself had morphed into a desire to degrade the very world that had made her. She decided to bring the brothel home. She would no longer go to the Subura. She would bring the Subura to the Palatine Hill, to the very heart of imperial power. She would transform a wing of the sacred palace, the home of Augustus, the symbol of Roman order and dignity, into her own private temple of vice. This was not just an escalation. It was a declaration of war on Roman values. It was sacrilege on an imperial scale. But this new venture required more than just a change of venue. A brothel needs workers, and Messalina had a very specific vision for her staff. She would not use slaves or foreign captives. She would not use common prostitutes from the city. She would use the women of the Roman aristocracy, the wives and daughters of senators, the descendants of ancient and noble families, the very women who were supposed to be the paragons of Roman virtue, the guardians of the family hearth. These would be the stars of her show. This was the masterstroke of her cruelty, the ultimate expression of her twisted need for control. It was one thing to destroy a rival's political career with a false accusation. It was another, far more profound violation to seize control of his wife's body and force her to perform her own dishonor. She began to issue her invitations, which were, in reality, summonses that could not be refused. A senator would receive a polite message requesting his wife's presence at a private imperial function. To decline was unthinkable. It would be a direct insult to the Empress, an act of defiance that would inevitably lead to accusations of treason and the complete destruction of his family. Imagine the terror in those noble houses. A young woman raised her entire life to value her purity, her pudicitia, above all else. A woman whose entire social standing depended on her reputation for modesty and fidelity receives the call. She knows what it means. The rumors are everywhere. She walks into the palace, a place she should revere, and is led not to a formal banquet hall, but to a lavishly redecorated wing. The air is thick with incense and wine. The rooms are furnished with couches, and there, presiding over the scene like a demented goddess, is the Empress Messalina. The ancient historian, Cassius Dio, describes how she would personally inscribe the names of these noblewomen onto a list, as if they were new acquisitions for a brothel's roster. They were stripped of their names, their dignity, their very identities as wives and mothers, and were forced to entertain the men Messalina had invited. Powerful senators, wealthy equestrians, and handsome courtiers who were part of her inner circle. Their choice was simple and brutal: submit to this public humiliation, or watch their husbands be executed and their family fortunes confiscated. This was not a chaotic orgy. It was a structured, ritualized degradation. Messalina turned it into a grotesque competition. She would pit the women against each other, offering prizes or praise to those who performed their duties with the most enthusiasm, and punishments or ridicule to those who showed hesitation or disgust. She was forcing them to become characters in her private psychodrama. making them act out her own contempt for the virtues they were supposed to represent. She was not just a participant anymore. She was the producer, the director, and the star of a spectacle of forced depravity. She would watch, she would judge, and she would take a perverse delight in the power she held over these women. She was systematically dismantling the moral foundations of her own class, proving to herself and to the world that even the most honorable woman could be reduced to an object if the pressure was great enough. It was her way of validating her own lifestyle, of dragging everyone down into the mud with her. If everyone was corrupt, then she was not a monster. She was simply the one who was honest about it. The psychological toll on these women is impossible to fathom. They were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. They had to return home to their husbands, men who were complicit in their dishonor out of fear for their own lives, and pretend that nothing had happened. They had to continue to run their households, raise their children, and maintain the facade of Roman nobility, all while carrying the secret of their forced degradation. Messalina had not just violated their bodies, she had poisoned their souls, trapping them in a web of shame, fear, and silence. And the silence of the Roman elite was deafening. No one dared to speak out. To challenge Messalina was to commit suicide. Her network of spies and enforcers, led by the powerful and corrupt imperial freedmen Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, was an invisible army that policed the thoughts and whispers of the entire city. They profited from her chaos, growing rich on the bribes and confiscated properties of her victims. They had every reason to keep the Emperor Claudius deaf, dumb, and blind to the truth. And so, the sickness in the palace was allowed to fester, growing more audacious, more public, and more dangerous with every passing day. Messalina, secure in her belief that she was untouchable, was about to make her final fatal mistake, a move so arrogant and so insane that it would finally force the terrified men of Rome to act. In the toxic ecosystem of Messalina's court, a new favorite had emerged. His name was Gaius Silius, and he was, by all accounts, the perfect Roman aristocrat. He was a consul designate, which meant he was on the cusp of reaching the very pinnacle of the Roman political ladder. He was described as intelligent, charismatic, and the most handsome man in the city, and crucially, he was married to a well-respected noblewoman. For Messalina, he was the ultimate prize, the one man who embodied everything she was supposed to respect, but secretly wished to corrupt. Her obsession with him was different from her other affairs. This was not a fleeting dalliance or a night of anonymous conquest in a brothel. This was a grand, public, and all-consuming passion. She showered him with gifts, lavished him with political favors, and made it clear to the entire Roman aristocracy that Silius was now the second most powerful person in the empire. She would visit his house openly, accompanied by a vast retinue, effectively evicting his own wife from her home while the Empress conducted her affair. The situation was a screaming scandal, a public humiliation not just for Silius's wife, but for the Emperor Claudius himself. Yet everyone remained silent, paralyzed by fear. Silius understood the game he was playing. He was dancing on the edge of a volcano. To be the Empress's lover was to hold immense power, but it was also to have a death sentence hanging over your head. He knew that Messalina was fickle, that her passions could turn to murderous rage in an instant. He also knew that the Emperor Claudius, for all his bumbling obliviousness, was still the emperor. If he ever woke from his stupor, Silius would be the first to be executed. And so, he made a desperate, high-stakes gamble. He went to Messalina with a proposal that was nothing short of insane. He told her that their secret affair was no longer sustainable. The danger was too great. The only way for them to be safe, he argued, was to stop hiding. They had to seize power for themselves. He proposed a plan. They would wait for Claudius to leave the city, at which point they would assassinate him. Then, Silius would divorce his wife. Messalina would divorce the emperor, and they would marry each other. Silius would then adopt her son, Britannicus, and rule as regent until the boy came of age. It was a plan born of equal parts ambition and terror, a mad dash for ultimate power as a way to escape certain death. A rational person would have recognized this as a suicide pact. The plan was clumsy, reckless, and depended on the loyalty of a court that was already seething with resentment. But Messalina was not rational. The sheer audacity of the plan appealed to her. The idea of becoming the wife of a handsome, powerful man she had chosen for herself, instead of the bumbling old man who had been chosen for her, was intoxicating. But according to the historian Tacitus, there was one part of the plan that she balked at: the assassination. It was too crude, too direct. Her real thrill, her true passion, was not in simple murder, but in the act of transgression itself. She came up with a counter-proposal, a modification to the plan so bizarre, so contemptuous of all law and tradition, that it still beggars belief. She agreed to marry Gaius Silius, but she wanted to do it now. While Claudius was still alive, while she was still married to him, she wanted to commit bigamy, an act that was not only illegal, but a profound religious sacrilege. She wanted to have a full, public wedding ceremony in the city of Rome, with a legal contract and witnesses, while the emperor, her husband, was away for a few days in the nearby port of Ostia. This was the ultimate act of her reign of terror. It was a performance of such breathtaking arrogance that it is hard to comprehend. This was not a secret affair anymore. This was a public declaration that she, Messalina, was above the law, above the gods, above the emperor himself. She was not just breaking the rules, she was rewriting reality. She was staging a coup, not with swords and soldiers, but with a wedding veil and a marriage contract. The ceremony was held at Silius's house. It was a lavish affair. A dowry was formally presented. The traditional vows were exchanged. Witnesses signed the legal documents. Guests, a terrified and complicit collection of Roman senators and nobles, attended and offered their congratulations. They were all participants in a collective act of treason, their presence a testament to the absolute fear that Messalina inspired. While her husband was inspecting the grain shipments in Ostia, ensuring that the people of Rome would not go hungry, his wife was in the city, marrying another man in a public spectacle of defiance. This was the mistake that finally broke the spell. It was one thing to whisper about the Empress's debauchery in the slums, or even the forced orgies in the palace. Those were private horrors, contained by fear. This was different. This was a public, legal fact. A marriage contract now existed that effectively delegitimized the emperor. It made her son, Britannicus, the legal heir of Gaius Silius, not Claudius. It was an act of treason so blatant, so undeniable, that it could not be ignored. The powerful imperial freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, the very men who had enabled and profited from her corruption, suddenly realized that she had gone too far. They had backed a wild animal, and now it was threatening to burn down the entire forest. Their own survival depended on getting to the emperor before Silius and Messalina did. They knew that if Silius took power, they, as Claudius's loyalists, would be the first to be purged. The race was on. A messenger was dispatched to Ostia, carrying the unbelievable news to the one man in Rome who still had no idea what was happening, the emperor himself. The stage was set for the final bloody act of Messalina's reign. The scene in Ostia is one of the most darkly comic and pathetic moments in Roman history. The Emperor Claudius, a man who commanded 30 legions and ruled a vast empire, was completely bewildered. When the freedman Narcissus arrived, breathless and frantic, Claudius was likely enjoying a leisurely lunch, perhaps discussing the finer points of Etruscan grammar with a fellow scholar. Narcissus, risking everything, bypassed the usual court protocol and laid out the shocking truth. He told the emperor that his wife had married another man, that a coup was in progress, and that his life was in imminent danger. Claudius's reaction was not one of rage or decisive action, but of utter confusion. According to the sources, he kept asking the same question over and over again, to anyone who would listen. Am I still the emperor? Is Silius a private citizen? He was a man whose reality had been so completely shattered that he could no longer grasp his own identity. He was so accustomed to being deceived, so insecure in his own authority, that he could not process an act of treason so blatant. He was a spectator at his own downfall. It was Narcissus who seized control of the situation. He understood that Claudius, left to his own devices, would dither and delay until it was too late. Acting with a decisiveness the emperor himself lacked, Narcissus effectively took command. He had the prefect of the Praetorian Guard summoned and, in the emperor's name, gave the order to march on Rome and secure the city. He then practically bundled the terrified, stammering emperor into a carriage for the journey back to the capital. The trip was a long, agonizing procession of paranoia. Claudius was convinced that his own guards were about to assassinate him, and he spent the entire ride in a state of terrified panic. Narcissus, sitting beside him, had to constantly reassure him, acting as a combination of bodyguard, advisor, and therapist to the supposed master of the world. He was the real emperor that day, a former slave who was now steering the ship of state, while its official captain cowered in the cabin. Back in Rome, Messalina and Silius were celebrating. They were in the midst of a bacchanalian festival, a drunken, chaotic party to celebrate the autumn grape harvest, and, in their minds, their own successful coup. The grounds of Silius's house were filled with revelers. Tacitus paints a vivid picture of the scene. Wine flowing freely, partygoers dressed as satyrs and maenads, and Messalina herself, her hair unbound, leading the wild, ecstatic dancing. She was at the absolute peak of her madness, a Maenad queen celebrating a victory that had not yet been won. It was in this moment of supreme arrogance and drunken revelry that the first messengers arrived. They brought news that shattered the fantasy. Claudius knew. He was on his way back to Rome, and he was not alone. The Praetorian Guard was with him. The party dissolved into chaos. The drunken senators and nobles, who moments before had been toasting the new couple, now fled in terror, scrambling to distance themselves from a plot that was rapidly unraveling. Silius, for his part, understood that the game was over. He made no attempt to rally his supporters or fight back. He simply went to the Roman Forum, the center of public life, and waited to be arrested. His mad gamble had failed. Messalina's reaction was more complex. Her first instinct was to try to save herself. She knew Claudius's weakness, his tendency towards indecision and mercy. She believed that if she could just get to him, if she could confront him face to face, she could use her beauty, their shared children, and her formidable force of will to win him back. She set out on the road to Ostia, hoping to intercept his carriage. She was a pathetic sight. The Empress of Rome, the woman who had terrorized the city, was now reduced to riding in a common garbage cart, abandoned by all but one of her former companions. She managed to intercept the imperial procession, and for a moment it seemed her plan might work. She began to scream for Claudius to listen to her, to hear the mother of his children. Claudius wavered. He was on the verge of granting her an audience. But Narcissus, ever the pragmatist, intervened. He drowned out her cries by loudly recounting the list of her crimes and lovers, reminding Claudius of the marriage contract and the undeniable evidence of her treason. The carriage door remained shut. The procession moved on, leaving Messalina weeping in the dust on the side of the road. She retreated to the gardens of Lucullus, a luxurious estate she had coveted and seized for herself through a campaign of terror against its previous owner. It was a fitting place for her to await her fate, a monument to her own greed and cruelty. There, she alternated between fits of rage, moments of desperate hope, and the slow, dawning realization that her world had come to an end. Even in this final moment, her mother, who had been a distant and disapproving figure throughout her reign of terror, came to her side. She urged her daughter to do the honorable Roman thing, to take her own life, to choose a clean death by a dagger rather than face the humiliation of a public execution. But Messalina, the woman who had orchestrated the deaths of so many, could not bring herself to do it. She was a coward at her core, her audacity a mask for a deep and profound emptiness. She simply wept, her final hours a pathetic display of self-pity. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. While Messalina wept in her garden, the final act of the drama was taking place in the palace. Claudius had returned, and Narcissus, knowing his master's weak will, engineered a masterful piece of political theatre. He had Silius and the other conspirators dragged before the emperor. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions immediate. Claudius, now safely surrounded by his loyal guards and fortified by wine, was finally stirred to a semblance of imperial authority. He ordered their immediate execution. One by one, the men who had been Messalina's lovers, her allies, and her victims were put to the sword. The purge was swift and merciless, but the question of Messalina herself still hung in the air. After the executions, Claudius retired for dinner. According to Tacitus, he became remarkably cheerful, his mood lightened by the food and wine. He gave an order that the poor woman, as he now called her, should be told to come and plead her case before him the next day. In that moment, Narcissus knew he had lost. He saw the emperor's resolve melting away. He knew that if Messalina was allowed to see Claudius, she would survive. Her power over him was too great. A tearful reunion, a reminder of their children, and all would be forgiven. For Narcissus, this was not just a political risk, it was a death sentence. A forgiven Messalina would be a vengeful Messalina, and he would be her first target. He made a decision of breathtaking audacity, a move that was, in itself, an act of high treason. He decided to murder the Empress without the Emperor's permission. He stormed out of the dining hall, and acting as if he was carrying a direct order from Claudius, commanded a tribune and a group of centurions to go to the gardens of Lucullus and execute Messalina immediately. It was a lie, a usurpation of the ultimate imperial power, but in the chaos of the moment, no one dared to question it. The soldiers, grim-faced and professional, made their way to the gardens. They found Messalina on the floor, her mother holding her, trying in vain to convince her to die with dignity. The tribunes stood in silence as the centurions entered the room. The sight of the armed soldiers finally broke through Messalina's self-pity. She understood that there would be no appeal, no reprieve. She took a dagger, but her nerve failed her. She tried twice to press it to her throat and her breast, but could not bring herself to push. It was the tribune who ended it. Disgusted by her cowardice, he stepped forward and ran her through with his sword. And so, Valeria Messalina, the she-wolf Empress, died at the age of 28, not with a defiant roar, but with a pathetic whimper, in a garden she had stolen, killed by a man acting on a lie. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Narcissus went back to the emperor, who was still at his dinner party, and informed him with chilling simplicity, "Messalina is dead." He didn't say how or by whose command. Claudius, in a final stunning display of his detachment from reality, showed no emotion. He did not ask for details. He simply ordered another cup of wine and continued with his meal. In the days that followed, it was as if she had never existed. The Senate, in a display of sycophantic fervor, ordered a damnatio memoriae, a damnation of her memory. Her name was chiseled off public monuments. Her statues were torn down and destroyed. It became a crime to even speak her name. The Roman elite, who had cowered before her in life, now scrambled to erase every last trace of her existence, and of their own complicity in her crimes. Messalina's story is more than just a lurid tale of sex and violence. It is a profound and disturbing case study in the psychology of absolute power. She was a product of a system that gave a teenager the power of life and death over millions, a system that placed no checks on her impulses, no limits on her appetites. She was a woman who was both a victim and a monster. Her cruelty fueled by a deep-seated insecurity. Her depravity a desperate search for meaning in a life that had none. She tested the limits of her power and found that there were none, until she created a transgression so immense, so public, and so insane that the system had no choice but to destroy her in order to save itself. Her hunger was not just for sex. It was a hunger for control, a hunger to remake the world in her own corrupt image, to prove that everyone, no matter how noble, was just as empty and depraved as she was. In the end, her greatest legacy was the chaos she unleashed, a chaos that would ultimately consume her own children. Her son, Britannicus, the boy for whom she had schemed and killed, would be sidelined and eventually murdered to make way for a new heir. The infamous Nero, who was brought into the imperial family by Claudius's next, and even more dangerously ambitious, wife, Agrippina the Younger. Messalina's reign of terror had not secured her dynasty. It had merely paved the way for an even greater monster. She remains a chilling warning from the ancient world, a testament to the fact that the most dangerous predator is not the one who lurks in the shadows, but the one who sits on the throne, convinced that they are a god, and determined to drag the entire world down into their own personal hell.